The legacy of the Gewehr 1888 wasn't finished in our last episode. Instead, we will now see it undergo another change, a decade before the Great War. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a Greek Mannlicher-Schönauer Model 1903, a gun that is much more famous for its sporting role than its military one. But we're a show about World War I, so let's get this guy over to the light box. With an overall length clearing 48 inches and a weight above 8 pounds, this is a hefty, cumbersome weapon. It loads 5 rounds of 6.5 by 54 millimeter from a stripper clip into a rotary magazine. Now, as is tradition, I need to set down this rifle, and we need to have a talk about some contextual history. Germany had the Mauser 1871 and paired it with a tube magazine in the 71-84. Austria-Hungary had the Mannlicher 1886, which loaded from an end block clip. The French introduced their own 1886, the Lebel, which pressured everyone to switch to smokeless powder in a hurry. In just a year's time, a German commission would take the Mauser action and improve it with front-locking lugs provided by Louis Schlegelmilch. They would also add a barrel jacket from Armand Meeg, and a modified Mannlicher clip system, which could now be loaded from either direction. They chambered the gun for a now famous rimless 7.92mm cartridge. OEWG in Austria was upset about the appropriation of their patented technology, and so, through either lawsuit or other agreement, they became the sole exporter of the Gewehr 1888 design, which they improved upon to sell to other national militaries, resulting in the Romanian 1893, Portuguese 1896, and Dutch 1895 family of rifles. Alright, is everybody caught up to this point? Because if you're not, and this seems kind of brief to you, then that means you haven't been watching our previous videos, because a lot of guns stack up to form this one. Now, the most recent of which was the Romanian 1893. That especially you should definitely go watch before we wade in any further. But for now, let's turn our attention to the immediate issue and talk about Greece. In 1897, Greece would go to war with the Ottoman Empire in a bid to incorporate the Greek majority populated Crete. Known as the 30 Days War, this endeavor did not go well for the Greeks. The steep reparations demanded by the Ottoman victors would force them to concede to international financial control. Now, this obviously had long-lasting effects on the Greek government, and it would create a system of repeated turmoil into which that we can't really delve that deeply into Greek politics, because I feel like I'd need a master's degree just in that to get through any 20-year period of Greek history. It's amazing and terrifying when you're trying to talk around it. But regardless, what we care about is the fact that this conflict really drove home the need for Greek modernization of their military forces, because you see, by the time of this conflict, well, the Ottomans had already updated to repeating smokeless rifles. As a matter of fact, they'd already had two, the Mauser 1890 and the later Mauser 1893, although how many were present at the far reaches of the empire is anyone's guess. And heck, before that, they had already adopted a black powder repeating rifle that we'll get to later. So what did the Greeks have? That's right, their standard rifle was still the single-shot black powder Gra, a gun we've previously covered. You know, I think I might know at least one contributing factor to their defeat in that conflict. Anyway, it shone a hard light on the fact that they definitely needed a new rifle, which, by the way, like any other nation, ever since the Lebel appeared and even before, the Greeks had puttered about with repeating rifles and smokeless designs and things like that. They just hadn't taken it all that seriously. But now, well, give it a couple of years and the right people finally getting into place. Again, too much detail for us. But we finally get a proper set of trials. They would start with several Mauser rifles, including the Swedish 96, Belgian 89, Spanish 93, and that Chilean pattern 1895, and one Romanian pattern Mannlicher. Interestingly, it seemed that this first round of testing favored two designs, the Swedish 96 and that Romanian 93. So right from the start, I think we see a commonality. Both of the selected rifles were in 6.5mm cartridges. Now, we've talked about the advantages of this sort of cartridge before. You can carry more ammunition because it's lighter and smaller, and it consumes less material to produce, and science tells us that if we throw it fast enough, that smaller weight bullet does just as much damage in certain contexts. It's a whole other argument for a whole other time. But one of the best advantages, though, realistically, of a high-speed, small-diameter cartridge is that you have nice, flat trajectory, which means a longer point-blank range. And generally, if you gear it right, you can also get less perceived recoil, which is terrific as well. So, obviously, the Greeks favored this sort of compromise in terms of their ammunition. But they also were looking around the world, and they had noticed with the wrap-up of the Spanish-American War that those Spanish 1893s and 7mm, well, maybe they didn't win the conflict, but the Americans seemed to be taking them awfully serious, and they were definitely battle-proven. Maybe we should swap out that Swede for that 1893. So that leaves us comparing a Mauser 1893 Spanish style to a Mannlicher 1893 Romanian style. Okay, same year, but in hindsight, a lot of us know which one's the stronger overall system bang for buck. However, the Greeks at the time still favored the Mannlicher, and in ideal conditions you can kind of understand why. There's less fiddling when you're using an M-block clip like we've seen, and Mae's certainly appreciated. And OEWG is someone they've worked with before with the GRA, and they trust them. So it's slightly going into that favor, but in a power move in 1900, the directors at Mauser would reach out to German banks and try to secure loans for the Greek government to be able to buy rifles from Mauser in Germany. Had that worked, we would have an entirely different episode here today, but it appears the German banks took a look at the Greek situation and they shook their heads and said something to the effect of nine-way Joseph. So that means that it's an open table. Nobody's giving them a sweetheart deal just yet, which means that the Greeks are going to stall. They really aren't looking to spend a lot of money because they don't have any. But that doesn't mean that OEWG sat around doing nothing in the interim. Them and Mauser would both start developing their rifles further. And in the case of the Austrians, well, they'd roll in some ideas that they had been kicking around for a couple decades. This is the gunsmith Anton Spatolsky, who is best known for working alongside Karl Holub to improve the Wurmtal rifle. But in 1879, he would also patent a rotary drum magazine design. Although, if he ever made a prototype, I've never been able to find it. His design would later be modified by both Konrad von Kromar and, more importantly, Joseph Schulhoff, who would improve the action to pair it with a rifle, one we've actually mentioned before in our Lee Metford episode. The Schulhoff rotary magazine rifle would garner a fair bit of attention, but no military adoption. So as we approach 1888, OEWG has Mannlicher working on his straight pulls, Schulhoff working on the Spatolsky rotary magazine, and, most important to our episode today, a factory manager named Othais Schönauer. Born in Reichraming in October of 1844, Otto was the son of a machinist and would apprentice as the same. He would travel to Switzerland to learn the latest in small arms development, and even served under one Friedrich Wetterli. Returning home, he would enlist in 1867, serving primarily as an engineer. In this capacity, he would meet Joseph Wurmtal, and once he retired to the reserves, he would be hired by the man in 1871. That means Schönauer was able to rise quickly to factory manager by 1875, and technical director in 1896, seeing the company evolve into the powerhouse OEWG. Now, ever since the Gewehr 88 has reached the hands of the Austrians, you've been hearing me say Schönauer's name, and that's because he was involved in just about everything OEWG put out throughout the entire time that he was employed by them. This man was a process refiner as best I can understand it. I mean, yes, he had some original ideas that we see in different fields and patents, but we can never be sure if he was executing somebody else's order or if he had come up with it originally on his own. And there's no such thing really as a pure Schönauer gun that I've been able to turn up. Instead, he to me seems like a Kijiro Nambu, a man who's perfectly geared towards taking what was a good idea and making it a fantastic one. Anyway, we know that he was playing with Spatolsky's magazine as far back as 1885, although I was unable to turn up the actual patent drawings that he was playing with. So that means that he's working with a rotary magazine before you even have the Gewehr 1888 rifle, which means When you see things like the Romanian 92 and 93 that we've already seen, well, that means that Mannlicher already had the rotary magazine in the back of his head, and at some point he would compare the two concepts, finally bring them together into, well, this. This is the Mannlicher-Schönauer Model 1900, a gun that was shown in an attempt to woo sales. Most notably, some significant number were trialed by Portugal before they ultimately decided on the Vigueiro, a gun we'll cover another day. But that left just enough made that we were lucky enough to put this one in our hands. The new gun was also paired with a new cartridge. This should seem pretty familiar as it's really just a rimless Romanian round. This means all the benefits of our previous episode without that troublesome little bit on the end. The load would be adjusted slightly by the time it was adopted though, giving just a bit more oomph. Alright, since we have the opportunity, let's take a look, without knocking everything over, let's take a look at just what went into this particular rifle. At first glance, you're really going to see a gun that doesn't look too much different from that Romanian Mannlicher. I mean, bolt open. Remember though, this gun is much more in line with what OWG wanted to produce, so instead of our underside ejector that we had on the Romanian, so if you recall from that episode we had an ejector down here, instead we have the ejector fixed to the bolt head. As a matter of fact, I can go ahead and pull that out, you guys. There we go. We've got our ejector fitted to the left side of the bolt head like they intended to have on that Romanian Mannlicher. As a matter of fact, it was on the 1892, as you recall. So no big changes here. Instead, and I'll go ahead and return this just so I don't lose it. There we go. Instead, our big changes are in the magazine system. Now, luckily, these are designed in such a way to come out quick and easy. You just give it a press with a bullet tip here. In our case, we have a patented plastic pokey hand. And move laterally and pull. And this guy's just a little snug over the years, considering he never really saw any field use. And that's going to reveal our rotary magazine. Now this takes 5 rounds, and you can see as it gets pressed along, the follower naturally wants to coil back the other way, and that's because of a clock-style spring set down in there that will be visible in our animation. Now, if I return this to the action, we can see that despite the unique magazine, loading is pretty dang easy. It's just a stripper clip like anything else. Although, this stripper clip is unique. This is actually a Greek Mannlicher stripper clip. It took us a bit of effort to turn this up. Now, these are, of course, deactivated rounds. Now, the gun loads from a stripper clip like normal. So I can just punch these guys in nice and smooth all the way in. Clip is obviously going to fling out of our way. And I could probably bash it with the bolt, but I'm going to be ginger with this. It's not like I can go get another one. And there you have it. So there's our round. And as we start to chamber this, you'll see we have a very direct positive feed that's controlled the whole way through. Now, the next round rests against this one until it makes contact with the underside of the bolt. Now that round's resting against the bolt. When we get everything out of the way, that round is going to end up resting against this little lever here, this interrupter. Now that's controlled by this button here. So if we ever need the rounds out of the magazine quicker, instead of pulling out the bottom and have them scatter everywhere, we can just gingerly press this button and have them scatter everywhere out the top. Anyway, I love cartridge fountains. Now, other features of this gun would include a nice full-length grasping groove, really long length. We've got our cleaning rod that can conceivably work as a stacking rod in this position, and our unprotected front sight. Nothing all that remarkable compared to any of the other Mannlichers we've seen, although the tangent rear sight is cleaned up a bit and seems wholly more modern. Overall, a very impressive rifle. I mean, the fact that I don't have a lot to talk about other than just the cool magazine system means that these are sort of features that, being common to us now, reveals that they're actually pretty reliable systems. I mean, yes, it's a split bridge, so we don't get our hand deposited as close to the trigger, and yes, it's, you know, not got the same sort of cocking sleeve as a Mauser 98, so that cocking mechanism is a little bit exposed when we pull it back, but overall, extremely strong idea, and there's nothing with a more positive, controlled feed than this. I mean, you do not have misfeeds in this particular rifle, although you might see that you can get a little bit of a drag. But anyway, who the heck is going to buy this thing? I mean, this is a complicated, expensive, and generally viewed as a sporting arm because of how fine it is. Who has the money? Who has the will to arm their soldiers with the best bolt-action rifle in the market at that time? In February of 1902, then Crown Prince Constantine was placed in charge of a committee to test and compare the Mauser and Mannlicher rifles for adoption. A large part of their decision would be financial, which makes the result all the stranger. By this time, as we've said, the Mannlicher-Schönauer had been introduced, and so it was pitted up against the Spanish Mauser 1893 in 7mm. Now, in August of 1904, excuse me guys, I gotta clean up my workspace a little bit. In August of 1904, this committee would go ahead and vote between this guy and a Mauser 1893. And what they came up with was sort of interesting. They had 6 in favor of the decidedly neat Mannlicher rifle. And by the way, this gun compared to a Mauser 1893, okay, you know, we're starting to look at some strong features. 6 in favor, 1 would go for the Mauser, and 3 would come up with various other opinions that don't really matter for this show. This is how all committees seem to go, and it scrambled the issue just enough that it got kicked over to another committee under the National Defense heading. So effectively, we're still spinning in circles, but at least that gave just enough time for the Germans to come back with their own improved Mauser rifle. Remember, it had been the 1893 against the 1893. Well, now it's the Schönauer 1900 against the Mauser 1904. This design, based off the 98 series, encapsulated a number of improvements such as a wooden handguard, flatter tangent sights, thinner stock profile, and simplified bayonet lug and barrel band. Seeing limited adoption, this design would mostly influence China and Thailand before evolving into a pattern we'll talk about in future episodes. The Mauser 1904 also introduced the Greeks to improved Spitzer ammunition. Now, a normal country would sit down and compare the same cartridge and ball and Spitzer for both rifles and see what was better. This is not a normal country. Instead, they would dicker back and forth for favor, and OEWG would say, you know, if you want a Spitzer cartridge in 6.5 by 54, we can do that. Just let us know, and they didn't, and it's another one of those things that went to a committee and then sat around stalling, and nobody got their head on straight about just doing a direct comparison. And so it's going to be a little while before anybody comes back around to, oh, wait, did we want a pointy one or a round one? And that's going to hurt them. You'll see in a moment. But now we're at a point where the Mauser is looking like it might be the favored rifle because, you know, the Crown Prince himself is going, I think the Germans have a good idea here. This gun looks a little more rugged and a little less fidgety than the good old 1900, which still impressive, but come on guys, it's the 98 Mauser improved. I mean, that's got to be the right decision, right? So this became a transparently easy question from this point on, which is why the Greeks managed to muddy it up somehow, because, like with anything else, politics and bribery. You see, this is the seal of the Greek-Macedonian Committee, and I really do not want to get into kicking this wasp nest too hard, but there's a lot of complicated politics around basically Greek nationalism. The shortest possible story that I can tell about this is that both Bulgaria and Greece wanted to lay claim to what was then an Ottoman territory, Macedonia. Now, both would fund local guerrilla groups against the Ottomans and each other. It was messy, but ultimately a lot of people started leaning towards the Greek issue, except the Germans. The Germans really didn't have a stake in the claim either way. And when you're Greece, that's a bit of a bargaining chip. And Austria-Hungary, however, wanted to sell hundreds of thousands of rifles through OEWG. They were willing to say, yeah, you guys totally deserve to have Macedonia. Fine, whatever it takes to get you to shut up and pay us money. So, not really. I mean, I'm sure there was more Austrian interest in Greece having interest in that area, especially when it comes to Austrian relations with Bulgaria, but they had something in common on Macedonia, and that made them feel much more amenable to an Austrian rifle. Also, there's a fair bit of signs that there were a number of payoffs and bribes going around. out of Austria and into Greece. Both powers were probably much more familiar with this system of governance. Anyway, that means that the tide ultimately turns back to the Mannlicher 1900, although it's starting to see some minor improvements, as we'll get to in a moment. And we're right on the eve of adopting this gun, and there really isn't anything left to stand in our way, except for one Greek bastard. Now, I'll ask everybody to pardon my Greek, but this is probably Philippos A. Philippides, who was born in 1884 in Panormos. Oh man, guys, I'm really bad at Greek too. Anyway, if there's no language I can't ruin. Phil would finish high school in 1902. An engineering prodigy, he would submit schematics for his own improved rifle designs at age 17. Seeing promise, the Greek Technical Committee would send him to OEWG to further his studies. In 9 months at the factory, he would come up with 2 improved prototype bolt-action rifles, both based on the current Mannlicher export pattern. They each used a simplified bolt system as depicted here. But rifle number 1 featured a rotary magazine, like the Schönauer. It had been simplified greatly and was set down in the stock from above. This eliminated the need for the open bottom and therefore weakened stock. Rifle number 2 used an end-block clip. Uniquely, this was a 6-round double-stack design, reminiscent of the later Garand. It used a spring-loaded bottom plate to prevent muck and mud from entering the action. Our friend Double Phil would show his unique designs to some friends and influential people back home, and at least one of them would leak them back to the Austrians. And so OEWG's staff became, well, rather upset. So they sent Double Phil home, and they kept both of his test rifles, which means he had no way to demonstrate their superiority. Or maybe not. It's hard to say. We don't exactly have an example to compare to this beautiful thing. But we do know that those designs, especially with Greek national sentiment and a Greek designer, well, they threatened the contract for this. And OEWG wasn't happy just to sell a lot of guns to specifically the Greeks. OEWG wanted to sell the Mannlicher-Schönauer. This was supposed to be the gun to go up against the growing Mauser export market. This was their sort of last bastion of saving their existing tooling and designs and taking back a lot of those lucrative contracts. So they just needed someone to adopt it first so that could be the stepping stone to more sales. And this kid wasn't going to be allowed to get away with this. So somewhat of a press storm would kick up. Some people would be called traitors to Greek nationalism, yada, yada, yada. But ultimately, the right people stayed locked in, and this gun would finally, well, not this gun particularly, as a matter of fact, let me set it aside. This gun, the 1903 that we've already seen at the beginning of the show, this gun would be ultimately adopted. So I think now would be a good time to take a closer look. Now, for starters, that contract was signed in April of 1905, but the guns are marked Model 1903. That's because that apparently was the last year that they did any updates to the pattern, and it just took a little ministerial time to get this thing to roll all the way out. So let's get a comparison between this and the original, because there aren't a huge number of changes. Overall, the bolt and magazine systems are the same, but if I get them into the same plane, and where you can actually see them, couple of things emerge. We've got our cartridge release on the newer 1903 is actually set into the receiver, whereas this one is out on the edge. They've notched the receiver, and they've even notched some of the wood to give it some room. This is a little smaller, a little tighter, and a little better set in. Additionally, slight changes to the layout of the stock finger rests, and if I walk her forward, good lord guys, this is hard to do. If I walk her forward, ever so slight differences in how those front sights are fitted, and they're just general layout. But otherwise, we're not looking at any huge distinct differences. I mean, if we really get in here with the gauges, we can find some slight variance in the widths of different bits. But, let me get this 1900 out of my way briefly. This is what the Greeks are locked into. So one more time, we've got a nice full-length rifle. Again, there would be a cleaning rod here. This one just happens to be absent. All the way down to our adjustable tangent rear sight. This is set up for that round nose ammunition. More on that in a moment. The reason for the curve here, by the way, in that finger rest is so that you know to lift the rear handguard from back here to not basically snap or crack it while trying to release the springs that are under there. You see this on the Dutch guns as well. And then our Greek crest has appeared, and generally we have on the other side our date of manufacture, along with the name Steyr for OEWG Steyr. Now, one last bit, because I didn't mention on the previous rifle, although it was there, is that these do have a beautiful, and I'm sure Mae will be very happy, semi-pistol grip stock with a deep Austrian-style grasp to it. Beautiful piece of work. At this point, I'm pretty sure I'm stretching the limits of your patience, talking about a gun that is overall very similar to last episode, plus a new magazine system. So, let's stretch the imagination a bit further, put on our X-ray vision, and head over for an animation. Alright, we'll load up 5 rounds from our stripper clip into this cool rotary mag, powered by an internal coil spring. The rest of this action, however, should be pretty familiar from the Gewehr 1888, except that ejector, which slides over the left locking lug, a feature OEWG fitted to the Romanian 1892, but was dropped by the time we got to that 1893. Again, this is the same safety flag system we've seen before, locking the cocking piece rearward. Alright, let's get this over to Mae. Now, I know what some of you are thinking watching the feed on that video, but I assure you this is a sample size of exactly 1 at the moment, and it's going to increase as we get deeper into this episode, so sit tight and withhold your judgment. Now, when these guys were first adopted, you're going to see a contract for 60,000 rifles. In the following year, you're going to see them sign up for another 40,000 rifles. This was done because contemporary Greek military reorganization had projected a standing army of 60,000 men and reservists of 120,000. So the initial 100,000 rifles would put a fairly big dent in that predicted demand. The price per rifle was apparently 79 gold francs. I have no idea what that works out to modern money. I tried doing some Google work, and somebody in the comments might be able to figure this one out, because I have no idea of the present value then of a gold franc, especially not compared to a basket of goods for today. And by the way, everybody would then argue about whether it was gold franc to dollar or gold franc to the price of bread and milk. Economics is hard, guys, but anyway, 79 quatlus, who cares? It seems like a pretty big number though, and I'm betting it was a little outside the Greek budget, which is perfectly fine though, because apparently they just paid a deposit up front, and then the rest on some sort of payment plan. I don't have a lot of details beyond that though. The original bayonet issued with these rifles would be patterned on the Austrian 1895, with a short, fat, single-edged, knife-style blade. By 1914, an adaptation of the Gras T-back spike would be rolling in. And with Greece's limited economic flexibility, it meant that despite having a new rifle and bayonet, ammunition would have to be purchased the next year. During this delay, they would finally seriously consider standardizing on the Spitzer cartridge, Remember, they had delayed on that. At the minimum, that would mean replacing the rear sights for rifles already in production. Well, OEWG gladly offered to charge them for the extra work, and they predictably said, never mind, we're fine with the bottlenose. Ammunition would initially be produced by George Roth and by Hertenberger, but the Greeks wisely chose to have some domestic production, and so they would merge their two biggest firms commercially independently available at the time in 1908 under Greek state ownership and form the Greek Powder and Cartridge Company. Now, this particular entity would be charged in 1912 with producing 60 million cartridges over the next 9 years. That number would later be dialed down to 45 million and of course be influenced by, well, the conflict we generally talk about in our show. So, the good thing about that footing though, the good thing about choosing that sort of stretch goal, even if they didn't meet it, is that they were set up for cartridge production before the war. And that's at least half the equation in owning these rifles, and they generally managed better numbers than the poor Romanians did because of that big stretch right at the beginning during peacetime. So good job on that one, Greece. Although, this is a good time for me to stop and remind people of one other thing though, which is that, again, the Carcano gets picked on fairly often for being such a simple rifle, but it was a rifle the Italians could make, and they could make it in large numbers. The Mannlicher-Schönauer is clearly a better rifle than the Carcano. However, the Greeks can't make it at home, and they're dependent on foreign purchasing, just like with the Romanians. So, as much as we might admire a gun like this, everybody take a moment and appreciate what can be made at home when it comes to big, big war. Turning back to our Greek guns, here's the thing. They would order different batches out of OEWG over the years, and I'm not going to break down each and every batch. Instead, let's just stop and appreciate that the Greeks went under a lot of changes from the time this gun was adopted until the beginning of the Great War. If you don't know your Greek history, I recommend checking out Wikipedia and then checking out a bunch of books, because there's a lot of nuance and detail there. And the biggest thing that I can really mention is something that kicks off in August of 1909. That's when a military coup, starting at the Gaudi barracks outside of Athens, would erupt under the leadership of junior army officers. King George would concede to their demands for a new government, replacing the prime minister. This was not enough, though, and marches and demonstrations would follow. Without getting mired in the details, the end result would be, in November of 1910, the election of Prime Minister Venizelos, who would organize a number of necessary reforms that proved pivotal to Greek history. For today, however, we only care that he looked at military reform and therefore drove the purchase of more rifles and ammunition, which wasn't a bad investment because, as we know, in 1912, we'll see the First Balkan War. This conflict has come up plenty in the show, so we'll skip to Greece's interests. Macedonia. And heading into this conflict, they had acquired some 113,000 rifles and nearly 24,000 carbines, and we'll get to those in a moment. Now, following the First Balkan War was a conflict known as the Second Balkan War. Who would have predicted anything like that? Anyway, basically that conflict revolved around the fact that Bulgaria was unhappy with some of its former allies keeping territory that Bulgaria felt it owned, Macedonia, and therefore they kicked off another war and were soundly defeated by their former allies and some extra help. We've talked about this one before as well. But the end result of that was that the Greeks realized that, investing heavily in their military and military equipment was a pretty good idea because it was already paying dividends just a few years down the road. So we need to do more of that. And we're going to go ahead and in the summer of 1913 really put some effort into adopting more of these rifles. Not a new pattern necessarily, but we would like some changes. There's just a few little things that we felt really weren't working for us during those conflicts. And so they would set away the 1903 and ultimately order up the 1903-14. This is the just ever so slightly pre-war Greek Mannlicher. Let's send it over to the light box. The overall length is the same and the weight only came up a teeny little bit. Same cartridge, same count, same clip. Basically the same gun. Regardless, the Greeks have a new rifle, and so we should probably take a closer look. Let's zoom on in. Overall, we're really looking at the same rifle. There's only some minor details changed. So if I scooter back, we'll see that we've lost that vertical cut in our grasping groove. If we walk her further back, probably the most outstanding feature is that we now have a full-length handguard. Before it stopped right about here. You guys can rewind if you care. I'm not going to muscle another gun up here. Still would have a cleaning rod, but if you notice, we now have a sort of M95 style stacking hook. This might have been something they picked up from their experience with the Bulgarians, but it's a much better way of stacking a rifle than relying on that little nib of a rod if you were using it at all. Alright, so new gun means we gotta send it over to Mae. Despite the lack of any real distinguishing differences, I think, especially because it is so similar to 1903, we need to get a sample size of 2 going. That is what I'm talking about. Beautiful gun. Now, like I said, in summer of 1913, they start looking around for a new gun, and then as you're going into 1914, the ink's finally dry, and we introduce the 0314. Now, what they would do is order 100,000 of these guys for delivery by the end of 1915, and another 100,000 for delivery by the beginning, springish of 1916. So 200,000 outstanding rifles. The unfortunate part about this is that, as we well know in hindsight, there was no hope that they were going to get all of those guns, especially by those dates, because war were declared. As we saw with Romania, and as we'll see again in our next episode, OEWG was told by the Austro-Hungarian government at the beginning of World War I, stop all the exporting. We're going to keep whatever's here and figure out whether or not we need it before we tell you where to put it. And so, from our numbers, we were able to find that roughly 52,000 of these guys made it to the Greeks before the cutoff. Now, that left 9,000 or so either finished or in a condition to be assembled over at OEWG, and those would be taken up by the Austro-Hungarian state, and they would be issued, interestingly, very specifically. You see, these guns, because of that rotary magazine, unlike the Romanian Mannlichers, do not lend themselves to being converted quickly over to 8x50mm rimmed. It would actually be a fairly complicated process, especially with the rimmed cartridge in that, very controlled feed. So the Schönauer wasn't going to be taken up for fresh production, and it wasn't going to go through a simple conversion process. It had to stay in 6.5 by 54mm, which was not standard ammunition. So they would put it with the Polish Legion. These infantry regiments were set up under the Landstrom, populated by, Poles. These units served both Austria-Hungary and Germany at the time. They would fight primarily on the Italian front. You can spot a seized Greek Mannlicher by the Austro-Hungarian acceptance mark WN14. Now, just like Romania last time, that means that this rifle has entered the war ahead of its home country. You see, the Greeks were still neutral. Alright, at this point, I've covered the 1900 that was out for trials, the 1903 that was adopted, and the 1903-14 that was updated, and a few had come through the door before it closed. That's where we had to stop, and then we had to take a step back and rewind. So I'll set this down, and I got nothing, all right? There was a 1903 carbine, and unfortunately I do not have one with me today. Instead, I offer you this photo that we took when we snuck up to Springfield Armory. With an overall length of just over 40 inches and weighing in at just about 8 pounds, this is a much handier little gun, although still fairly stout. Same cartridges, same 5 rounds, same everything. Now, I don't want anybody too disappointed that we don't have the 1903 carbine here today, because luckily I do have this, the model 1930 carbine, which realistically in terms of weight and dimensions is identical. There's just some slight changes to the fittings. More on that in a moment. This will do just fine for the handling and characteristics though, and it'll see us through the rest of the show. Now, the carbines were ordered both with and without bayonets, and to my knowledge I have not found one that did not have a bayonet lug. So, either there was some sort of conversion program later, or when they say without a bayonet, they just mean they bought one without an accompanying bayonet. Now, whether or not you got a bayonet with your carbine had to do with whether or not you carried a sword in the Greek military at that time. So if you're a cavalryman or an officer that's being issued a carbine and you have a sword, then you don't get a bayonet. If you're anybody else, essentially, all the way down to trumpeter, who might have a carbine, you get a bayonet. That seems pretty clear, I hope. Orders for the carbines would begin in October of 1906, in which 4,000 without bayonets were ordered for 74 gold francs each, and 3,000 with bayonets at 78 gold francs a pop. Now, as we covered earlier in the episode, additional orders would follow up until the Balkan Wars. And then afterwards, I've only been able to note rifle purchases all the way up until World War I. So presumably that's where the carbine wraps out until post-war purchases like this one. Again, in a moment. Now, I would zoom in on this gun right now and walk you through the details, but realistically, other than having a shorter tangent rear sight, there's no big difference from the long rifles, and what little features are on this gun will just be confusing because this is a slightly later model. So let's just skip ahead and put this into Mae's hands and let her give you a demonstration of how a Mannlicher-Schönauer with that 6.5mm cartridge performs on the range. I'm going to be very honest with everyone and say that this is actually a rifle I've owned for a number of years. For once, it's one of mine. And I love this gun for obvious reasons. But besides, my little affair, we need to get back to some history. So, at this point, we've covered 2 actually issued rifles, 1 trials gun, and then we have our carbine. Well, that sees us into the World War I era, but when exactly does Greece finally get involved in the conflict? Well, I'm going to take the easy out here and say that we already covered that in our previous episode centered around the Greek cult contracts, and so I'm not going to belabor the point. Instead, let's just skip over to the fact that Greece's involvement in the war mostly focused on fighting with Bulgaria and some springboard operations out of Macedonia, and they started to kind of wander up against Hungary, but Hungary surrendered, and that was the end of that. Now, with limited conflict comes limited experience with the rifles. Overall, I cannot find a single complaint, and it seems like the Greeks enjoyed their guns just fine. I certainly don't see anybody whining that the Mannlicher-Schönauer let them down in the heat of combat, and it'd be hard to imagine because these are very stout rifles. So that's going to be my soft answer until I say that after the war, they doubled down on the design and went to somewhat extreme lengths to order more. That is, after reconsidering our good old friend Double Phil. You see, he had stuck around and become the deputy manager of the Greek Powder and Cartridge Company, serving as a technical advisor to the Ministry of War. Following the conflict, he would attempt to reclaim his prototype rifles, finding only one of the two, and presumably his favorite, because he would submit it to testing by the Greek government in a bid to be the next official service rifle. As a reminder, this is the second pattern rifle with the staggered end block clip. Now, while that was going on, the Greeks were also looking to replace about 100,000 rifles. Remember, their original contract came up nearly 150,000 rifles short, so they still needed at least some of those arms in peacetime, because that was a peacetime plan to begin with. Follow? So they started searching around, talking to people like BSA and FN and manufacturers like that, but the bargain leader for them would be in Italy, Breda. Now, the Greeks were considering making Double Phil's rifle, and the Italians were probably favoring just making the good old Mannlicher-Schönauer 1903-14 because they probably had gotten a hold of OEWG's manufacturing equipment, or perhaps stocks of the existing rifles. And I've heard a lot of reports that all of the Greek rifles are just captured or somehow remanufactured original Austrian contract guns from before 1914, but the numbers don't add up. To get 100,000 of those rifles, they had to have overwhelmingly new production. So take that with a very large grain of salt that they might just be remanufactured originals, because I can't see Greece having lost 100,000 of them specifically into the hands of Italy somehow in the course of their limited exposure to the war, and nobody else was packing these things around. Follow the logic there, guys? All right. So, the Italians, though, I can almost guarantee would rather make a gun that had already been made and equipment already existed for and they likely already had gotten a hold of. But they were asked to make two examples of the rifle number 2 Double Phil gun, and those two examples apparently stunk. Now, Double Phil would blame the Italians for making it poorly because, well, they're biased, horrible Italians and they can't do anything right in his eyes. And the Italians would say, no, that gun's just too dang weird and it was never meant to be. Regardless, it didn't matter because the Greeks didn't want to spend a lot of time and money tracking whatever was going on with this, and instead opted to just go ahead and simplify their whole lives and pull in more of the same, although not the carbine. They would bring in more of these 1903-14s. And actually, I happen to have this, which is an Italian-made 1903-14. So if I make a little bit of space, we can actually do a little bit of comparison. Up and down. This particular rifle is unchanged in design from the 1903-14 of earlier generations. Obviously, there's some slight differences in the wood and finish, especially between these two guns that have two separate histories. But, you know, same grasping grooves, same front end with cleaning rod and stacking rod. Same bands, same sight layout, same bolt, same everything. Although, I will say, if anybody's been keen-eyed enough, this is the correct rear sight configuration. Our 1903-14 from the earlier contract at some point was modified by someone post-war. This is not original with that low ground-down sight. So, the one big thing with these guys is that 100,000 of them were ordered in 1925, and they were delivered in 1927. So you will see them marked Breda 1927. Now, in addition to these guys, let me get myself a little bit more room. In addition to those long rifles, in 1930, they would try to get 25,000 more carbines. And we've already foreshadowed this early in the episode, they would not be available from Italy, but instead, this time OEWG was somehow available to produce and export. And I have not gotten into the legalities of this, but I'm sure it just had been long enough that they managed to wiggle back out from under the thumb of the post-war treaties. But this carbine, the 1930 model, was actually produced back at home in Austria. And it was worked up from a commercial action that they had been producing throughout the interwar period. So let's take a closer look. My example is particularly haggard. You can tell that it's been rusted to the point of pitting and then cleaned back up later. If you look carefully, we have our turned down bolt handle, our shortened and lower set tangent rear sight, And then at the front, now the originals on these would have had no sight protector and just the cleaning rod. This also has just the cleaning rod and was never fitted with a stacking hook because it was a carbine. Later on in the 30 version, unique to this one, is this sight protector, which is very uniquely designed. So it's open top, prong front and back, and the idea here is to protect the front sight, but also allow the maximum amount of light in. It ends up being a terrifying looking affair. So, returning to the front, same overall stock profile. This one's obviously had a little love on it over the years, but she runs just fine by my standards. Now, the camera's a bit far and she's a bit pitted, so I'm going to just go ahead and flop some photos up for you to show that the crest would be marked 1903-14, although these are generally called the 1903-14-30 carbine, and the sidewall of the receiver is marked with a commercial Mannlicher-Schönauer 1930 system marking. I should also point out that in my notes I found reference to 15,000 carbines being ordered for the Gendarmerie in 1939. Whether or not they were delivered, who they were ordered from, these things I cannot tell, and I have definitely not isolated what one of those would look like, but just something to keep your eyes out for as you guys are looking around. Anyway, by the fact that these guns are still being purchased in 1930, I think it's clear that the Greeks still find favor with the Schönauer system, despite the expense and the difficulty of finding someone to make specifically this gun when it was so easy to get a Mauser made. But that doesn't mean that you can cling to it forever. And again in 1930, we're going to see FN develop their own Mauser, and eventually the Greeks are going to turn to purchasing small numbers of those to offset the more expensive and hard to come by Schönauer. 50,000 or so of these 7.92 by 57mm rifles would be ordered before World War II, but that's not nearly enough to displace the Schönauer. So that would leave our rifle today as the primary arm for both World Wars, which was honestly fine considering its chief opponent in the second would be the Italian Carcano, unchanged from 1891. Post-World War II, the Schönauer would finally be displaced by Allied gear and later NATO weapons. So it basically retired very slowly, and with a 2 World War history, plus the Balkan Wars, all that good stuff, this is a long, storied military rifle. It's just that it's not often talked about because it was used by exactly one nation. But many people recognize the name Mannlicher-Schönauer right off the bat because of its extremely strong commercial precision hunting history. This gun and the 6.5 by 54mm cartridge were infamous as big game rifles and extremely popular in African hunting for a long time. And again, even just in Europe, these things were highly prized, which made them very valuable because of their high quality of manufacturing. Which is interesting because it ultimately limits the number of the military kind that you can find, because if you think about it this way, when these guns were surplused, they were so cheap and readily available, and yet the action was the same action as one of the finest sporting rifles available. Of course, many of them were converted into hunting rifles. As a matter of fact, as nice as these guns can be, and if I had the cleanest possible 1903 carbine in my hand, it still wouldn't compare in value to some of these double set triggers and beautifully scoped and ornately engraved Mannlicher-Schönauer commercial rifles that are available for collectors today. So ultimately, even the military rifle is not as valuable as the sporting rifle, which means while people are generally more considerate, there's still an incentive to cut these things up in the current market. Thankfully, shows like ours, I hope, discourage that behavior. Anyway, let's get these things over to Mae and see how she feels about the Mannlicher-Schönauer. Alright, once more we've made room for Mae, and we've made room for 2 out of our 3 guns. Well, most of the room. With your Patreon funds, we will probably fix all the holes in our horrifying ceiling. Alright, so we have 2 near identical long rifles. There's not a lot of difference between the 03 and the 14, so I think we can roll these 2 together through Mae's description. So with that, why don't you give us an overview of the ergonomics for both of these guns?
Alright, so you know me guys, I tend to prefer my rifles a little bit shorter, I get more maneuverability out of those. So this guy, being as long as it is, and it's got a good bit of weight to it, it is fairly dense, isn't my favorite. However, that being said, This gun is fairly well balanced. I've got a semi-pistol grip, so I'm able to pull the gun nice and well into my shoulder. And it's actually narrow enough that I'm able to get a good solid grip right up here on the forend. I've got my full hand around the semi-pistol grip. I don't feel like I'm losing this at all. So while it is long and heavy, I've got all these pros that are really helping me to kind of just, I guess, puff the gun back up, which is nice. The action is very smooth, and you know what, it's insane. This gun is revered as one of the smoothest bolt actions of the war. People even compare it to the Krag Jorgensen. Let's see how that is. Yeah, I would agree. That is incredibly smooth. It's like butter. I can't believe it's not butter. Anyway, and last but not least, the safety. It's just a standard flag safety. There's nothing really special going on there with it, but of course, have to mention it. But yeah, in terms of ergonomics, it's a little long and heavy. That's about it. But it's got a lot of other pros going for it. But let me get the 0314 real quick from you. Differences. Not a lot. It's got this stacking rod up here, which if I had two other guns with me, I guess I could make a TP, which is neat. But when I'm shooting on range, it really doesn't come in handy. It's not a, negative either. It's just kind of there. So, meh, no real good opinion on that one. And last but not least, I've got this foreign stock that, for this guy, it is a pro because after shooting for a while, gun's going to get a little bit hot. I don't really want to have to worry about where I'm going to grip it so I don't burn my hands. So, yeah, I'd say this was a good addition to the gun. Adds a little extra weight, but I think totally worth it. You really don't notice it.
Well, I'd find that fairly comprehensive, and I'd agree. Honestly, the Mannlicher-Schönauer weighs what you'd think a gun this big would weigh. I think we've gotten a little spoiled by these sort of open-bottom magazines like the Carcano and the 1895 and the 88 and yada yada yada. We've had some light, long guns. This is a dense, long gun. But for someone like me, as big as I am, I actually don't find this to be all that much of a problem, but I'm not the average size. Now, we did skip out, though, on talking about shooting the gun and how it actually performs. So will you walk us through what happens when you pull the trigger?
First off, we're going to talk about the loading process. Now, I don't know if it was this awesome original Greek clip that we have. Yes, guys, you should be jelly. I had the authentic experience here. Or if it was the rotary mag, which I used a rotary foam. I expected that to be a lot less smooth than it was. Or if it was the rimless cartridge, but the loading process on these guys was awesome. It was so smooth. There was not a single snag throughout the dozens of clips that we loaded to get those shots that we needed for the shoot. So I don't know what it was, but it was awesome. The planets aligned. It was amazing how smooth it actually was. So I love that. Lining up the sights. They're not bad for their time. They're tall V-notch sights for their time. Not great right now, modern times, but they were all right enough. The trigger, simple two-stage, smooth light at the beginning. Of course, second stage gets a little bit heavier, clean break, short. It was nice. And the recoil. Wow, okay. I wasn't kidding before when I mentioned I like 6.5 cartridges, but 6.5 rimless? That really might be my favorite of the war because out of this guy, it just felt, I don't know, it of course was more than 22, but didn't really feel like it was that much. It just felt perfect. It was amazing. But yeah, for shooting with these guys, I was deadly accurate. The action was smooth. There was a lot of pros with this. Now, I will say, this was the 0314, and it was smooth like butter all the way. Whereas when I had the 03, y'all could obviously see there was some jamming issues when it came to cycling rounds. Personally, honestly, I think it was just this particular gun because this was just a sample size of one. And I have shot a lot of Mannlicher-Schönauers before, and I just don't think that it was the system that was the problem. I think it was a specific gun. So me personally, I would like to shoot another one to just try to give it another shot. Pun intended, guys. So if any of you have an 03, please send it our way. I would like to give it another try. But otherwise, shooting-wise on this 0314 was awesome. That 03 did fire well. Just wish the cycling had been a little bit better. That's all.
All right, things are looking up for the Greeks' decision to buy one of the finest rifles of the war. I wish we knew what the modern value of a gold franc was, because then we would be able to ascertain whether or not you want to pay that much money for this gun over another, because there's no arguing that these are very, very fine rifles. So, let me set this guy down, and as a matter of fact, let me clear your hands too, because
Aww.
I don't know why you're complaining. We have to talk about the Carbine.
Yeah.
Now, again, this one is from 1930. Honestly, guys, I've handled the original 1903s just fine. I don't see any difference. Not in terms of the operation, recoil, or anything like that. So, unless I'm missing something very fine and hidden, this should be a suitable stand-in. So let me hand that over to you.
Yes.
And let's get your opinion on how you feel about the Schönauer as a carbine. I think we can roll the sort of ergonomics and firing into one big go.
So yeah, this is what I needed from the long rifles. It's shorter, it's lighter. For maneuverability's sake, this has what I need from the long rifles, which is awesome. And the best part about it is, when I was shooting that 6.5 cartridge out of here, I thought in the long rifles it fit, but man, for the carbine, I think those two were just meant for each other. Like, it was not overwhelming. It was perfect. Like, I didn't feel like I had to take that long to reset my shots. Like, it was awesome. I mean, the only real potential downside I could see to this guy is that turn down bolt, but hey, it's actually sticking out pretty far on the carbine, which I'm able to get a good solid hand on there, and it's still smooth. It's a lovely action. And you know what's hilarious about this? This gun is in awful, awful shape. I mean, it is pitted all to heck. Even the follower, which I wish you could see, it's got some notches in here that, like, just scream that everything about this guy should be rough. It shouldn't feed, like, clean. It shouldn't cycle round smooth. Yet it was perfect on range. It was smooth like butter. In terms of reliability, this is what I think of when it comes to a gun. This was awesome.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you heard that from both of us now. This is a gun that at some point was rusted, pitted, and then, granted, polished back up a little bit. But you have to understand, it's not easy to get these old milsurps that have been through the ringer like this one has to come back to this level without major surgery. And this clearly hasn't had major surgery. I can lay my hands on here and I can just feel the bumps along the surface of that bolt.
God, it's so bad.
This is a rough little carbine, and yet it is as smooth as silk. And it works. It works well. So short of our friends over at In Range sticking one in mud, I think we can probably make a fair consideration of the fact that, as fine as we tend to think of the highbrow sporting rifle of a Mannlicher-Schönauer is, I think it's actually quite rugged. I think it actually can do the work that it needs to on the front line. So that leaves us with the last question, which may be obvious at this point. Would you take any of these into battle?
Absolutely not. No. Yes. I'm just sorry. I couldn't hold my face long enough on that one. Yeah, okay. So the only one that really gave me problems was the 03, but like I said, I think it had more to do with the gun than the actual 03 Mannlicher-Schönauer, so I'm going to give each of them a yes. And of course, if I'm going to pick my favorite, I'm going to pick the carbine for the hard yes. This just had all the features I needed from the long rifles. And you know what? I think this one's actually going into my top 5. Where it is, I'm not going to say just yet because I feel like you guys already got a good taste of that too early on in this series. So we're going to wait to actually give another May reveal top 5 until much later on. But yeah, this one definitely made it in there, and somebody got pushed out.
How incredibly titillating. I'm on pins and needles. Anyway, we have a lot more guns to go, by the way. I know a lot of you are going to speculate, and I know a lot of you think we're close to the end of this series. And I assure you, we are not halfway there. But anyway, that's going to wrap us up for now for the Greeks, and I want to make sure that I say that you particularly stay behind for the updates after this episode because I have some thanks to hand out. All right, night everybody.
Bye.
update time, everyone. First and foremost, the previous video to this one, if you're watching this out of order, was me explaining where we're at with the whole YouTube monetization things. And if that's all died down, or the entire world has turned inside out some year in the future, welcome to the time capsule. But anyway, I want to make sure that I thank all of our patrons, especially because whatever we might have lost on YouTube has already been made up by patrons, and then some. So we are definitely going to take those funds and roll them into even more improvements on the show. Now, in that regard, I do have to welcome another member to the team. This is going to be Matthew Britton, who you might have seen in the credits. He's been helping us out with some patent research, and some of you guys' money has been going to getting some of those things out of old European archives and into the light of day for everyone to enjoy. Specific to this episode, I need to give good, clean thanks to Nick over at Gunboards for sharing a digital copy of his book, just the pages I need, no piracy here. And special thanks to Valentis for helping me with research and especially with translation and reaffirming my notes before we went into the episode to avoid any mistakes. So thank you both. And again, every episode of this show is to some degree a team effort, but a lot of these, like the Romanian and the Greek, were definitely made possible by other researchers being directly involved. I am really just a communicator. Alright, thank you everyone, and have a good one.